Hi, I'm Ashley Neville, Director of Insights at Carta. Thanks for joining us for a peek at the 2024 State of Startup Compensation Report. I have Josh Steinfeld, the Principal Product Consultant, or not consultant, Principal Product
Strategist, whatever.
Strategist.
It's a bizarre title, so we can just call it whatever we want.
He oversees our Carta's Total Compensation product. Welcome, Josh.
Thanks for having me.
So we're going to review about 4 or 5 charts from the State of Startup Compensation Report that comes out next week. This is a report that Carta puts out twice a year, normally early in the spring and early in the fall. Josh, can you tell us a little bit about how the data comes from, or how we gather all the data for this report?
Yep. So we gather data from a couple sources. First, we draw heavily from our Carter Total Comp data set, which is made up of over 800,000 data points across thousands of companies who use Carta. From that data, we're primarily getting employee information, pay data, et cetera. So we're able to look into the data, see what an engineering manager at a company with a $15 million valuation is being paid. And we combine that with data that we're able to get from Carta Cap Table, obviously. And that's what makes Carta Total Comp so great is by virtue of being connected to Carta Cap Table, we do have the largest equity data set for private companies that's out there. So Carta Total Comp, really robust tool for not only benchmarking comp, but also doing some forecasting, planning, analysis, and also some communications tools, both for employees and for candidates.
Fantastic. I think one of the really interesting things about this data is it's really the system of record for employers. So we're getting the live salary data. This isn't a surveying someone about the data and them being able to, tell us this is the actual offer on their paperwork, right?
Yeah, it's nice. Like up until a few years ago, when companies were looking at compensation benchmarks, they're really relying on what was essentially outdated data all the time. You would submit your data to a survey once a year, and the data would come out once a year, and it would be lagged by a number of months, and you sort of had to guess what was going to happen from there. Mm-hmm. With Carta Total Comp, we're hooked right into HRIS, we're hooked right into the cap table, and so we're able to see things happen nearly in real time. So our benchmarks update quarterly. Which is about how often you'd want to do it to see meaningful changes. And from with that approach, you're sort of always on top of what's happening in the market. We're able to very quickly spot trends.
Awesome. So should we look at some trends?
Let's do it.
Okay. So
here we are.
Word from our lawyers, don't construe anything we say as advice. All right. So let's talk about this chart for a second. So the black line represents employees hired, and the green line is voluntary departures, and then the orange line is layoffs. And if you combine the green line and orange line together, you get the purple line. And I think if you can look out into December of 2024 there, you notice all of the lines trending down.
Yep.
And I think that's really the big message of what's going on right now in the hiring market, right? Everything is starting to trend down.
Yeah, I mean, when you're talking about startups in particular, the hiring market and the comp market are like very closely tied together. So if you look back to sort of the heady days of 2021 and into 2022, there was a ton of hiring, and not surprisingly, the market for comp was like red hot. And if you're into this stuff, if you remember, this was also back in the days when we were talking about like, should we be having 8% merit increases to keep pace with inflation? So, like those types of discussions. And then things quickly turned. We see the downturn in the hiring market as we get towards the end of 2022 and into 2023. and comp kind of behaved accordingly.
Mhm.
Uh, Now we're in. I don't really know what to call it. I don't know if I would call it like a stable market or a new normal market, but things have sort of gone back to what you would like normally expect. Like if we sort of assume that the hot market and the cold markets that we've seen in the last couple of years were outliers, we might be back to what looks like a more sort of conventional market. We sort of exist in an age of uncertainty, unfortunately. So it's kind of hard to predict this stuff or know where it's going to go. And I think companies are struggling with that as well. Predictability is good for business, but I don't think we have a lot of predictability right now. So we'll see. But I think the trends that we saw in hiring, kind of roughly do translate into some of the comp trends that we'll talk about in a bit.
Right. And I would imagine this is also really tightly correlated with the amount of total investment cash raised by startups, right? Because that
Yeah.
January 2020 is really where we saw the height of cash being raised by startups.
Yep, 100%. Like when the fundraising spigot was kind of turned
Mhm.
off in 2022, sort of the first impact was on hiring. And it's
Yeah.
just like, hey, like we're not going to hire the way we were hiring. We actually need to, downsize some of these companies. Maybe we hired like entirely too many people. And I think we're still seeing some of the effects of that, and we'll see that in a bit. But also, it does also come back to comp. Like
Mhm.
you'll in a few pages, we'll see what I always call the scariest chart in the world. We saw like a very, very quick impact on
Mhm.
employee equity grants. So we'll talk about that in a few minutes.
So overall, the number of new hires was down 85% from that high of January 2022 in December, and it was down about 50% from Q3.
Mm.
When we look at that Q4 number. But we're also seeing voluntary layoffs and actual layoffs tracking down. So
Yep.
there's just a lot less movement of employees right now, right? If companies aren't hiring, people aren't necessarily leaving to take another job.
Yeah, I mean, it's still tough out there for some roles. If you think about like product managers, for
Mhm.
example, like there are a lot of product managers on the market right now.
Yeah.
Companies aren't staffing the way they used to, and a lot of folks across a number of different functions were laid off, sort of during the peak of those layoffs at the end of 22 and into 23. So you still have a labor market that's full of a lot of people. There's a lot of competition for roles, and I think it just means that employees in particular are just kind of looking for a little bit more stability.
Mhm.
There's question marks out there if you're going to move, especially if you're going to move from one startup to another startup.
Mhm.
What is that equity going to be worth, and is that part of a package that you're going to value? And
Right.
so there just may not be as much of an incentive
Mhm.
to change companies and change roles as there once was.
Mhm.
Uh, Not to say it's not happening. Obviously, it's still happening, but I do think sort of the shape of the workforce at a lot of companies, continues to change, and we'll take a look at that in a minute as well.
Awesome. Um, you know, the overall labor market did grow in December. But we're seeing actually sort of a shrinkage of the startup market, right? With that purple line being over the black line.
Yep.
Why do you think that startups are maybe not responding the way that the entire labor market is responding?
Um, it's a good question. Sometimes December can be a little bit down as a hiring month. You essentially like lose half the month to
Mhm.
holidays. Um, so it's possible, and I think you see this in the other years if you kind of
Mm.
squint, but January always looks to be like a bit of an uptick.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't be surprised if the hiring line kind of starts to trend up, and it would go above the purple line if you look into Q1. So I don't think it was anything like specific about December. I think we'd have to get a few more months out and see what the trend is from there to see like if there is something.
Right.
But at least like what we're seeing on the comp side in Q1, and I know we don't cover that necessarily in this report, but we're continuing to see sort of a modest uptick in comp in Q1, which tells me that hiring is not necessarily slowing down in like a meaningful way. So it could just be sort of like a blip at the end of the year.
A little blip. Well, and 10% of all rounds in a year happen in December, right? So companies are really focused on closing deals, and then they get that hiring jump in January, right? When they get the cash in the door.
Exactly. And I think if I remember right, we do have, there are other tools across Carta that sort of help companies think about hiring and sort of planning out employees. And if I recall correctly, I think we did see sort of an uptick in those in December and even into January. So, I think like if you look at that as a leading indicator, then I would assume that we'll see like a little bit of a tick up if you were to sort of trend this forward into 2025.
And I think the other thing we should probably note is that departures show up immediately in our data set, but sometimes hires can take a little bit of time for companies to put them in. They wait for the board to approve the equity grants right before they sometimes get into the system. So we always see those departure numbers, and then the hiring sort of ticks up over the coming months.
So our data is pessimistic to start, and then it gets better.
All right. So let's look at industries for a second. So the number here that you want to pay attention to is 1. That's sort of the sort of flat growth. 1 is the replacement number on this chart. So anything greater than 1 means that the industry is adding headcount, and anything below 1, that would be the blue, is decreasing their headcount. I think as you look Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4, all of a sudden you get to a lot of blue. So although the year is up for a lot of industries, I think with the exception of hardware, everyone was down in Q4.
Yeah, so interesting. And, maybe I'll call this like the second scariest chart in the world. So, maybe, I think there could be some of this like lagging effect with new hires coming in. But, I think, again, I think you may sort of get this like kind of slowdown at the end of the year where, employees will tend to leave towards the end of the year, especially if they're, maybe there's a bonus payout that they're already entitled to, and they can just take that and leave. And companies just haven't had a chance to backfill the role by the time the quarter ends. Like, you could sort of easily see something like that happening. But I think if you kind of focus on the full year and kind of the macro trend, I mean, you could almost order those industries by like, intensity of human investment. So, you need actual humans to, design and to some extent build hardware and medical devices and things like that. And as you get kind of down the list, it almost becomes easier to automate a lot of what's going on. And when you get right to the bottom, when you look at gaming, we were just kind of talking about gaming before this started. I mean, that industry, as I think a lot of people know, has been hit like really hard by layoffs and some other staffing challenges. So not super surprising to see that towards the bottom of this list.
Yeah. So that's, I think, really interesting, the idea that maybe companies are trying to run a little bit leaner where they can and use AI and technology to supplement their existing team, maybe when there's a departure, rather than adding, either backfilling that role or even growing the team.
For sure. And I was going to say, and you see it here, especially like in the early stages, team size, any way we look at this, just like we see team size shrinking in early stage companies.
Yeah. So this chart is comparing on the left of each line the number for 2022, and on the right of each line 2024. So we're looking about industries across the top and then stage by the bottom. So these are companies that closed around in 2024 that we're looking at. And the green ones are increasing and the gray ones are decreasing. And I think it becomes really clear here what you were saying before about the more labor intensive human capital required industries. Those are the ones that we're seeing growth, and the ones that are very tech focused, we're seeing companies running leaner, less employees, sometimes even a whole employee less, almost 3 employees, half the size in consumer.
Yeah, I mean, some of these are really stark. Like if you look
Mhm,
at especially some of the Series B changes with,
mhm,
consumer and fintech and even to some extent SaaS. Um, I think like we've all been in this situation before, right? Where you're sort of like talking to someone, you talk about a company, you're like, oh, how many employees does that company have? And they tell you, and you're like shocked. You're like, oh my God, they have like that many employees.
mhm,
And we never would have thought of it
right.
about it that way just a few years ago. You're like, oh, great, like just hiring all these people. But I think founders were really sort of forced into this
Mhm,
again when sort of the funding dried up a couple years ago. It's just like, hey, like this is just not how we're going to run the business.
yeah.
And there's a renewed focus on profitability uh,
Mhm,
across startups, and so it wasn't just add heads to grow. In a world where revenue sort of solved all problems. Revenue is obviously still important, but we hear it over and over from investors where yeah, revenue is great, but we want profitable growth.
mhm,
And people expense is always the biggest expense.
mhm.
Unless you're paying OpenAI jillions of dollars to use to use ChatGPT, but it's a major expense, and so we're just doing more with less, and we see it kind of across industries, and we see it across stages as well.
Um, do you think that maybe some of the reason why we see an uptick in Series A is we see a lot of companies at Series A start really expanding their sales force?
Yeah,
Is that maybe why we're seeing an uptick there, or could there be another reason?
I you know I think that's part of it. I think some of it may be some hires coming on earlier.
Mhm,
So just purely anecdotal. You know, because of the nature of Carta Total Comp, I work with a lot of HR people at our customers,
mhm,
and it just seems to me that companies are bringing on like that more strategic HR executive earlier.
mhm,
So, I think there was an old way of thinking where you could kind of like get away with not having an HR person or,
mhm,
at least not like a strategic HR person until you were sort of a more, of a more significant size.
mhm,
But we're seeing, real kind of heads of HRs, chief people officers really in that earlier stage. Maybe it's not seed, but, certainly Series A. And so I think that where someone might have been hired at Series C, maybe they're being hired at Series A now. And so
mhm,
I think there's a little bit of like movement between stages and sort of when they're being hired. But to your point before, like, sales, uh, sales hiring and sales compensation,
mhm,
like robust, like through this whole thing, like maybe the one function that was immune. But like the flip side of it, and I don't think we have it today, but maybe I think it's in the full report, is tenure of salespeople tends
mhm.
to be lower than any other function. So there's certainly a trade-off there.
Yeah, we do have that in the full report.
Yep.
Um, all right, so I think we have one more slide, and then we're going to do some Q&A. If you have a comment you'd love us to tackle, feel free to put it in the chat, and we will get to it in just a minute. So this is the scariest chart, the one we're going to
There it
end
is.
how you read the chart. So on the left, we have November of 22, and on the right, we have December of 24. And the black line is the change in salary from November 22. And orange is the change in equity from November of 22. And as you can see, there is a huge divergence that happened peaking sort of around September of 23. So over that year, the amount of equity that an employee got was significantly less. And then that's pretty much stayed the same And with a little uptick here in both equity and salary in December.
Yeah, so this is always a fun chart to show a room full of people who have never seen this chart before, because it's always like kind of a shocking and
Yeah.
jarring moment. So what was going on here at the end of 22 into 23, if you kind of think back to that hiring chart, like this is when the hiring market essentially flipped over.
Mhm.
So this is when, you had a lot of layoffs happening, not a lot of hiring, and the message had gone out from investors loud and clear, like, hey, like, don't plan on coming back for more money anytime soon.
Mhm.
And so, normally, or historically, as you thought about comp at startups, it was always like, well, we'll pay cash, we'll pay what we need to in cash, but like, we'll really use equity to get people in the door. The
Mhm.
promise of future value in that equity is really going to come in. So what you saw in the before times was, companies would manage their cash burn and maybe be not as kind of rigorous around their equity burn.
Mhm.
Well, the world changed, and so companies had to be sort of like equally rigorous across both.
Right.
And so what we saw with early stage startups was, okay, like, we're not going to raise more money anytime soon, which means we're not going to re-up our equity plan anytime soon. So we just need to be really judicious with how we're giving equity out to new hires. And, we're not going to go sort of above and beyond, um, you know, the way we have in the
Mhm.
past. And then you have later stage companies where, if they're granting based on dollar values, and valuations are falling, they couldn't afford, from a dilution standpoint, to keep granting the same amount of equity. It
Right.
just wasn't feasible. So we saw this dip, and I was convinced something was wrong, and I started like DMing everyone at Carta, being like, "What's going on here?" But no, it was right. And so we saw equity basically go through a correction over
Yeah.
the course of a few quarters, landing where it was. And we've seen this uptick now. And on the salary side, we've seen sort of this, again, almost like a return to normal, where, salary increases tend to be around 3% a year. We're kind of getting back to that as we see, quarterly increases in our benchmarks of around, 0.5 to
Mhm.
1%, a little bit above that. And I think even as we look at Q1 this year, I think we're sort of around the like 1 to 1.5% increase. So kind of like, at least on the salary side, a return to normal. But I
Right.
think on the equity side, we're in a new normal.
That makes a lot of sense. Um, Dan added a comment in here about just making the point that November 22, there were really low interest rates at that
Oh yeah,
time, right? And so companies had other ways of raising money besides going to investors, right? They could um, there was more liquid capital available.
yeah,
Um, and so, sometimes it's more interesting to go back and look further back in time. We don't have that in this chart, but we do have that in our median salary ranges that are in the report. We do go back a little bit further than 22. I think we go back to 2018 in the
yeah. I think if you were to like zoom back on this chart,
Mhm.
you would see that orange line with the equity. You would see that like well above the zero line.
Right.
The salary line is probably going to be a little less interesting. I think you'd probably see it peak somewhere in 2022,
Yeah.
in the sort of like, I don't know, 2 to 4% quarterly growth range. Salaries tend to not stray too far from
Right.
that zero line, but yeah, the equity line would be a much more sort of divergent picture.
Hmm. Agreed. Um, so what are you really excited about that is in the comp report that we didn't talk about here?
Hmm. That is a good question. There is a lot. Some of this we break down a little bit more by function,
Hmm.
which is always sort of interesting, and even by level.
Hmm.
Just because I think some of the changes by level are not always what you would expect them to be. Like, I think especially as you go through economic downturns, executives tend to come through those a little bit better than other roles. But that's not necessarily true across all of our data. And I get that comment from some of my friends and compensation friends all the time, where they're like, "Oh yeah, like interesting to see some of the changes in like entry level and even sort of like mid level roles."
Mhm.
Again, they're not necessarily intuitive, but they do sort of sync up with what people are seeing in the real world. So it's always interesting to see how our data backs that up. We also track option exercises, so employee option exercises. That's always interesting to see. I think it really drives home the point around equity education and how employees think about equity. And I think it's kind of a good thing for all people, leaders and leaders in general, just to chew on and think about, like, how do you think about and talk about the equity component of your compensation to really make it worthwhile, both for your employees and to make sure that like you're getting a return on that investment. So always interesting to see that.
Yeah, very, very interesting. So we did a little preview today. 4 of the 35 charts that are in the report. We're going to take a look at some of the other charts in our full webinar on March 26th. The report itself comes out, I believe, on the 17th. And you're going to be in Vegas next week. Can you tell us a little bit of what's going on then?
Yes. So I will be at the Transform conference in Las Vegas. We'll have a few other cartons there. The most famous carton, Peter Walker, will also be there. He'll be speaking at a couple of things. I'll be speaking at a couple of things. So would love to connect with folks. We'll be roaming around. We'll also be at a happy hour that we're co-hosting with our friends from Sequoia and Rippling. That'll be on Tuesday, I think at like 5:30 at the club at the Wynn. I forget what the club is called, but it's like the big nightclub at the Wynn. You can't pass up an HR happy hour at a Vegas club. So be there. We'll be there, ready to talk Carta, ready to talk about compensation, and would love to meet some of you. Actually, would love to meet all of you.
Yeah. Well, I'm sad I'm not going to be there. And then again, state of compensation report comes out March 17th. And the link is in the chat if you'd like to sign up for the webinar, the full webinar on the 26th. And we'll have some special guests joining us for that conversation, right, Josh?
Yes. Yep. We'll have a couple other folks, and it will, as always, be a great conversation.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. And if you have more questions, feel free to put them in the chat in advance of the webinar, because we'd love to tackle those. And thank you all for joining us. Josh, thank you for joining me today for this conversation.
Yeah, thanks. This is great. Bye, everyone.